Welcome to our Brown Bag Work Hack series brought to you by HeadHunt in partnership with James Cook University. Broadcasting live, we have with us Associate Professor Frederick Low from James Cook University, who will be sharing with us on the topic of life transitions, growing up, not old. Before I hand over the time to our speaker, please note that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, so please feel free to type in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll also be conducting our feedback poll at the end of the session, so please stay with us throughout. Without further ado, I'll now pass the time to Frederick. Over to you, Frederick.
Thank you, Tammy. Welcome everyone in the room to this Brown Bag Lunch Talk. The topic we have today is about life transition. And as low tagline say, growing up and not growing old. There's a little story about the tagline, which I'll tell you in just a bit. Let me just share my screen so that we can get things going. Yes. As I was just saying, there's a little story behind this little tagline. Yeah, it came to me after working with a couple, a client of mine, through my practice as a counseling psychologist. And then as the couple was going through our discussion about marriage and so on and so forth, we start to ponder, right? When in our life, we shift from saying that we're growing up to a point somehow, it happens to all of us, we say we're growing old. So long story short, we end up agreeing that we're all growing up all the time, right? Especially knowledge, skills, and wisdom. And hopefully that's the case for you too. So there's a little bit about the tagline. My name is Dr. Frederick Low. I'm from James Cook University, and I'm really happy to be here to spend some time with you this lunchtime to talk about life transition. Maybe just a little bit about myself, right? So that you have a little bit of a background and you know where I'm coming from as we talk throughout the session. I'm a consultant counseling psychologist. I run a small practice. And I have the necessary registration both locally as well as in the UK. In fact, I have been practicing for more than 20 years and I've been teaching for much of the last 10 years or so. But becoming a full-time academic was actually quite a recent one. So I do have a recent transition I can share with you about. Yeah. In my years of practice, I work with many individuals, families, couples over many difficulties, including many of them involving life transition, such as career, marriage, parenting, retirement, so on and so forth. I like what I do because I'm attracted to live human experience. So in short, stories, right? Human stories. So doing this via Zoom can be a little bit unusual for me. I'm quite used to talking to actual audience. So please feel free to put in the chat and as well as in the Q&A section some question and some response, and I'll try to respond to you, and then I have a sense that someone is listening to what I'm talking about. But I'm not very good in multitasking, so I'll try my very best. I see we have a very diverse group here today. We have people from the corporates, we have people from, in fact, all the three sectors, the people, public and private sector, seems to be well represented here today. So in life transition, it's actually a very broad area and it's broad for a good purpose, because life transition doesn't just happen in one aspect of life, it doesn't happen just at work or family, a relationship and so on and so forth. It kind of cut across. That's one. Two, often life transition that happens in one part of our life often has systemic effect to the rest. For example, if something happened in family, it often would affect us at work and vice versa and so on. Let me just see whether anybody has some response on the chat. So just to ensure everybody can hear me well and we're in the right pacing. Yeah. There we go. Okay. Now, thank you so much, Jolene and Madeline. At least now I know people are listening and can hear me. All right, so we shall start to look at what people talk about life transition, right? Naturally, the first part of call is our dictionary, which tells us transition is really a process of changing from one state to another, right? In layman terms, for what we do, changing perhaps from a job to another, and sometimes moving house is a transition, changing in terms of our life stage and so on, can also be a bit of a transition across. And a lot of us will know as we grow up, we move on in our life stage and life roles, right? Like becoming a parent can be quite a bit of a transition, if you like. So some would say that life is a story of transition, moving from one to another. You kind of leave a chapter and then you move on to another. And that's very much the case. I suppose it's quite personal as well, right? For some people, they go through change more often than others, while some remain quite stable in one state, and so on and so forth. So if you think about transition, it's really about, in life we have many destinations, isn't it? And many goals and so on. And we try to, if we see it as a journey, we try to move from one destination and one place to another, right? One state to another, so to speak. So what makes up the journey then is not just this destination, it's the little journey, a little pathway, or the little dotted lines that connect all this destination that we have, and they make up the whole journey. So transition, actually, if you think about it, make up a relatively big part of our life journey. And it is, as I shared over here, a quote from Rob Michelle, that transition in life can offer opportunity for discovery. And that's what we're going to talk about today a little bit, about how it can offer us opportunity for discovery as well as self-mastery. And for those who are more action-oriented, some will say that change is the only constant, and then transition is the only stage, right? There's perpetually transiting as we move from one state to the other. Now, we can move on to the next slide. We will look a little bit more about different types of transition. Here we are. Really, what are life transition and why we should pay more attention to them? To be really honest, I think we are all expert in life transition because we all have overcome many life transition already by now. Perhaps some of you have more than I do. Yeah. This could be life stages, such as moving from childhood to adolescent. And for some of us more familiar with moving from adolescent to early adulthood and launch ourselves into the workplace. So all this involves some transition along the way. And for a lot of us who are in the workplace, changing of jobs, sometimes mid-career change in some sector, moving from one industry to another, preparing for retirement, and some more complex ones perhaps involve relocation, going overseas to work, and repatriation, coming back, all right? All this involve a lot of transitions. It can be about relationship, and I think some of us are familiar with moving from not knowing to knowing, become friends, and dating, and marriage, and starting a family, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of transitions again along the way. While I'm not suggesting we all go through the same journey, right? Some of us skip some parts of it, right? But more or less going through those paths, there are transitions involved. Sometimes transition can also be about health, right? Especially as we move along. There might be a time that some of us may like to slow down our pace with life a little bit, and then do seek treatment for some health conditions, and then that might involve some transition for us in changing our lifestyle and so on, and then for us to recover from some health difficulties before coming back to busy life. So that itself is a transition as well. And I'm sure a lot of you will hear stories from friends and people you work with who have gone through some of this at some point of their life. So in many ways, transition is a part of life. Unfortunately, we seldom focus on them as much as we should. Right? I'm quite surprised. We do get quite a good mix and quite a good group of people here wanting to think and talk about transition and to listen about what transition is about and how to handle them. Because a lot of times, especially when things go well, transition to transition, we don't quite look back and ask ourselves what have worked and what haven't, right? Some of us do. Perhaps we should do a little bit more than usual, or then we should do more than what we're doing now. But on the other hand, very often we pay a lot of attention to transition when it did not turn out well, right? It did not turn out the way that we want it to be. So I work with many individuals who face difficulties in their transition, and whether it's in marriage, relationship, leading to perhaps divorce or breaking down relationship, or a job change and so on. We may face a lot of difficulty along the way. So I work with a lot of people going through transition, and sometimes this transition, as I've introduced, it doesn't just happen in one aspect of life, it happens across, and sometimes they come together, right? And that's even more stressful if that's happening. For the more careful ones, I also work with people in marriage preparation session, for example, or career planning and career development. So in this work, we are actually, we work with individual who wants to be better prepared for the next transition. Later, which we will see, I'll try to categorize transition for you, and you can see some transition are a bit more scheduled, a bit more planned. So it's something that you can be more prepared for. Today, I'll try to offer you some insight about this phenomenon, about life transition, some practical tips of how to approach them as they come along, and finally, how we can benefit, right, from reflecting and consciously accumulating crystallized intelligence or wisdom, right, if we call it, as we grow up. Well, we do grow old too, right, but we should kind of grow up in that respect. So in the next 40 minutes or so, we will try to gain a better understanding what transition is, the impact they have on us. Again, I'll offer you a little bit of a framework where you can have a quick glance about how certain transition may, what kind of impact it may have on you, on us. Some practical ideas, what we can do in face of transition, in better preparation for it, and how we can examine the experience and traveling those journey from one place to the other, right? From one state to the other, examine some of those transition experience we talk about just now for more self-discovery and more self-mastery, right? What we are not going to talk about though, we're not going to talk about the how transition, especially when it go badly, when it not go very well, how does it impact our mental well-being? We're not going to talk a lot about the coping methods. Now, this is by no means to say that these are not important. In fact, quite the contrary, right? But it's not a focus of this session. We do have limited time together. But if you are going through a difficult transition and you are facing a lot of difficulty and you're feeling the need and you do want to, please seek out help of a counselor or a psychologist. If you need someone to point you to where to find some of these resources, I'm quite happy that we get linked up by email. I'll give my email address in the first slide, and you will see my email address at the last slide as well. So because it's important that if you're going through some difficulty at this point of time, this talk may not be so useful, right? But getting to see your personal counselor or psychologist would probably be more helpful for you. Yeah. Now remember, seeking help is a sign of strength, yeah, not weakness. And that's a core message I would like to repeat at some point later. I'm just checking and see whether there's any questions along the way. No, so far, okay, good. Now, so coming back, talking about transition and put it in real life very much. It's about moving from one state to the other, right? As we just talked about. So whether it's job, family, moving house, and so on and so forth. And a lot of us know moving house is quite a bit of transition, right? And a lot of us are still more or less traumatized by moving house, isn't it? We have to leave our boxes, packing, unpacking, what have you. So that period is transitions, right? And some of us are a bit deterred by it, while some of us are actually looking forward to the next move, yeah? It can be also be a change in terms of role. For example, perhaps due to something happened in the family, we have to become a full-time caregiver for our elderly at home or the young and so on and so forth. So it's really moving from one state to the other. And in transition, actually what happened is when we were at a stable place, whether it's a job, house, family, whatever, relationship, whatever, we often have a bit of a stable routine or regular routine. Something is more predictable, something that we are comfortable in, something we have been practicing over time. And we are often very familiar with things around us. There's a sense of comfort, and some people say the comfort zone, right? So there's a comfort zone in the family, there's a comfort zone at work, comfort zone among your social circle, and what have you. We also would, and in that comfort, we also have, we are clear with our own strengths, our own values, the value we bring to a company, for example. So therefore, we naturally feel good esteem, right? We feel good about ourselves. So moving from that place to another, for example, and often it's because there's a better opportunity, or often it's just essential for us to move from one house to another, from an apartment to another. And for some, just now we talk about relationship, right? Moving from perhaps dating to getting married and what have you, starting a family and so on and so forth. So very often what happens is that what we are really concerned about and what we are really worried about is some of the stability and the routine, the comfort, the familiarity. Would it carry on in the new space, new job, new work, new career, or new house, and what have you, right? So we ask whether the routine will continue, right? Will we have a new routine? Will we be as comfortable and so on and so forth? Will we feel as valued, or we know what we are contributing? So sometimes what happens is that sometimes we say messages are lost in translation, and sometimes some of this stability can be lost in transition, right? And that's why we ought to be quite concerned about how we treat each transition, especially big ones, complicated ones, right? How do we spend more time and energy in curating some of the transition to ensure that it kind of worked out a little bit, or at least to preserve some of these things that we have that we really enjoy, and the comfort and so on and so forth. So we all hope the transition will happen the way like what the chart will look like, right? Just one straight line, lines, calm lines. But in real world, it doesn't necessarily happen this way, yeah? This is what we know. You see the lines are a bit messy at this point of time. So in real world, anything could happen, right? Often transition may be longer than we think. It may take a longer time than you have originally planned. There may be things that happen. For example, perhaps you're moving to a new job, but sometimes even before we land ourselves into a new job, much less settled in, right? Sometimes the job scope has changed, right? Because somebody else left, and then there's some more work that needs to be done, and so on and so forth. Or if you're getting married, which is a big transition, there's a lot that has to be done. For example, like getting a property, housing, and booking the venue, getting your paperwork done, and so on and so forth. So there could be many twists in between. So it often doesn't happen as one straight line, so to speak. Yeah. And sometimes we arrive at a different entry point in the new job, for example, right? We may end up, perhaps in a better position, or maybe not, and so on. And just an example of, actually, because I work with a lot of adult students. So apart from clinical practice, I work with students. And then not too long ago, a student was about to join us. Everything prepared, right? Mid-career person doing very well in the corporate world and so on. Put things aside, put money aside, getting ready, sign up for the course, about to become, wants to go the journey to become a professional counselor with our Master's of Guidance program, guidance and counseling program, which I'm overseeing. And then something happened at home, right? And then he's not local, so he ended up having to be a caregiver, right, to somebody. So he had to fly back to where he was from and then take up the role of being a caregiver, right? So in that sense, even a planned transition can hit a twist, if you like. Yeah, but I hear he's coming back very soon, sort out what he needs to be done, and then you're back with us very, very soon. Okay, so of course we know sometimes the transition may be in such a state whereby we miss the destination altogether, right? And sometimes this can be, this have kind of serious consequences. Sometimes it doesn't. It can be a small or low stake transition, but sometimes it could be a big one, right? And then we end up, we miss the destination altogether, and then we have to turn back a little bit. We may do a U-turn to back where we started. It's a bit like, you know, taking a flight and then and turn back due to technical difficulties. Now we can take a flight soon, right? Because now there's more opening up, we can more talk about traveling and moving around a little bit. But that's the transition too, isn't it? Indeed, so transition can be very dynamic, right? And require us to prepare and respond to it so that it works for us, so that the journey works for us rather than lead us astray, if you like. To get settled in a new job, perhaps even in a new country, if we're talking about relocation, if we're talking about even a new role, sometimes we, for example, parents, I work with a lot of parents who have to switch and then to move along when the child becomes a teenager, right? If you take on a new mindset and so on, there's a bit of transition, right? Yeah. Okay. So it's really quite important for us to understand the very dynamic nature of what each transition is. Now, in order to help us with that, so one of the first things we have to do is to understand transition. We have to understand it to deal with it, right? But bear with me, although I don't think it's very technical, but we have to size transition up so that we know what we are up against, right? And a lot of us, or all of us, have been through a lot of transitions. So by now, you know that some are planned and scheduled, right? Moving to college, for example, going to college, for example. A lot of us plan for our wedding, our marriage, what have you. For some, moving out of state or going to launching to the workforce and so on and so forth. So some transition are planned or scheduled so that you can actually make a plan. But some transitions are sudden and unexpected, right? We could drop out of school, right, for one reason or the other. We could face a retrenchment, a loss of job very suddenly, right? Versus if you kind of plan to resign and move on to another job, which is a bit more scheduled and planned. So all this can happen at work as well as at home. As I mentioned just now in the example, something can happen at home, which have an immediate impact onto us with additional responsibility that we have to take up, and then therefore unexpected and sudden transitions imposed upon us can be a lot more difficult to deal with versus the planned ones. Another way to look at transition is to look at the stake that it comes with. Now, some transitions are relatively low stake, right? Some transition are really relatively high stake. So if you get it right, or at least get most parts right? If not, you will miss the destination and so on and so forth. It will cause a lot more other problems. One example is relocation, right? Expatriation, right? Going overseas to work when you're given the opportunity, right? It's a good opportunity. Destination is good, right? But the transition itself is very high stake because it involved, as the next point, we'll say this is one of those what we will call a multi-event transition, right? It's not just about one transition of changing a job. You may be changing a company, you may be changing a role, you're changing a job, you are changing a place to live and stay, moving house. So it is really very high stake because one of the reasons is because there's multiple events. If you look at the next point, if we look at relocation, we can also kind of classify whether some of these multiple events are sequential, one things that happen after another, or is it concurrent, right? So sometimes it can be concurrent, right? Everything happening at the same time, by a certain time, you have to be at a certain country, at a certain place, at an office, or settle down to start to work. Or sometimes it can be sequential, right? Maybe you moved over, you settle in, and then you move your family over, and so on and so forth. So the last point of being simple and complicated. So how complicated it could be? If you are having relocation and your family is going along and coming along with you, it could be much more complicated because it adds on to the multiple events that are involved. The children may have to change schools, they have to get settled in, new bunch of friends, and so on and so forth. You probably need to get residence that's suitable for the whole family rather than just yourself. So it can be complicated. So you can use some of this to kind of have a gauge when you have an impending transition coming, to size up the transition. Is it high stake or low stake? Is it multiple events? Is it sequential? And is there some way you can add some planning to it? So the same can be said about getting married, right? Because I do a lot of marriage counseling and marital work, and of course I will refer to it. And I like to talk about both work and life transition because they are actually so related, right? I find it a bit hard to compartmentalize, even though sometimes we really have to, right? So getting married is a multiple events, right? Getting the place, the ceremony, the paperwork, buying a house perhaps can be embedded as part of it, and the celebration and so on and so forth. It's relatively high stake. I haven't quite met a couple who tell me it's not very high stake, right? You have to work, right? Especially when they come in to do marriage preparation, they always have the aspiration to make it work, yeah? So that's why a lot of them seek marital therapy and so on and so forth. And it can be quite complicated, especially now these days we have a lot more transnational marriages, right? People from different culture coming together, getting married, different system and so on and so forth. And already sometimes we say marriage is between two families, right? Rather than two individuals, depending on which perspective that you think. But if they come from very, very different national culture and values, that can make it more complicated. So these are some ways you can unpack some of your transition. So this can work both ways, right? You can look at the past transition you have, especially those that work out well for you and so on. And you can have a sense, or you can kind of classify them a little bit. That helps you to better understand why it was much more difficult at that point for you, and then perhaps what else you could have perhaps done better. Another thing I'll share with you to help us understand impact transition have on us. Well, the word I use is how it affects us rather than impact. Impact tends to give a more negative connotation. Now, what I'm about to say is that transition, much as the change would right cause some impact or you affect us, but the transition itself, the journey itself, has its own impact or effects on us. And the model I'm lending you is called the BPSS model, right? The biological, psychological, social, and spiritual. And spiritual over here, we're talking about more like values and belief, if you like, right? So if you take, for example, what you can see my slide is a little bit small. If you anticipate a moving of house, right? Moving from one place or the other, and Singapore is not exactly that big, but if you move from one place to the other, there's still quite a lot of biological, physiological changes it has on to us, right? Because your whole living environment is changed. And now we work from home, right? The place that you live and work are all changed, right? The things that you see on a day-to-day basis, things, the size of the room and what have you. So you would, if you anticipate the impact on you, you would more or less kind of determine that, wow, it will impact you physically or physiologically quite a bit. You can also anticipate or rate it, if you like, that moving house will affect you psychologically quite a bit, right? Because your routine will perhaps be changed. Perhaps your entertainment will maybe enhanced or maybe downgraded, we don't know, right? Maybe the Wi-Fi and what have you and so on. So psychologically, maybe even that maybe you have more rooms for your family and you, maybe more personal space, what have you, that will affect you and help you perhaps positively in a psychological way. You'll definitely be affected more or less. Again, it depends on how you rate it yourself. You want to anticipate, for example, how socially you'll be affected, right? Your neighbors will change, perhaps, right? You may or may not be living closer to your clique of friends. You may or may not be moving closer to your in-laws, and I leave it to you to decide whether that's a good or bad thing, right? But you could be affected in that sense, right? So moving house itself. So if you use the BPSS model, you could have more or less shape it up, and you can, in preparation, understand or anticipate in what way that transition would affect you. Yeah. Another example, of course, is change of job, which we talk about quite a bit. And in this case, it may affect us a little bit more when it comes to the spiritual domain, right? Because you change your job means perhaps you change your company. Company culture is different. The way they work is different. The way you practice, the way you do things is different. So it affects about how you believe in things. It will challenge how your worldview is, right? Your value is, and so on and so forth. It will definitely affect you socially, because if you have a new group of colleagues and friends and people you work with, you have a new boss, right? Sometimes you don't even need to change your job, right? Sometimes you change your boss will sometimes have this impact and create this transition that is as if you have a new job. Yeah, it would affect you psychologically. As I say, the routine will be different because new job, maybe the location is different, maybe the scope of the work is different. Maybe you're given new roles like being to be a manager, to supervise, and to support other staff, and so on and so forth. Right? It may affect you biologically in a lesser way, perhaps. Right? Perhaps the work time is still the same. Perhaps the traveling is still much the same, and so on and so forth. So using the model, you can anticipate if you have an oncoming transition, you can anticipate which part of your life will be affected most and by how much, right? And then another example here, and now we're going to talk on the more high-stake bit, right? Which you see the diagram, it then affects and stretches you a lot more, right? So if you look at relocation and getting married, for example, right? So you can anticipate if you relocate, it affects you physiologically quite a big way, especially if you're moving from a country to another, right? And sometimes this country is a very, very different culture and so on and so forth, right? And it will affect you psychologically because the culture is different, the work culture is different, and the scope of work and what have you, right? And of course, it will affect you socially because it brings you away from your local base of social relationships and then moving on to a new place. And really depends on whether you have already some network over there. Yeah. And affect you perhaps in your values and your belief, your outlook, and so on and so forth. That's why relocation is such a very high stake transition. And a lot of companies invest a lot of energy. Usually they offer some support through the company, HR or external consultancy to support to make sure the relocation works out well. People settle in the transition is okay for the candidate as well as for the family and so on and so forth, right? Yeah. Same could be said about getting married, right? It's a big thing. Some of us have to move out. Most of us move out of our house, or some of us will move out of our house. You involve multiple events, right? Going into a new house, building new relationship with the extended family, and so on and so forth. So of course, some of us are courageous enough to do both at the same time now, right? You get married and relocate at the same time now. These days is not so uncommon, I think. But then you would have to anticipate, then there's a lot more that's going through, right? A lot more effects and impact that you would have. So using the BPSS model, it helps you in some way to anticipate, right? Or to reflect upon some of the transition that's imposed onto you. And by now, as we talk about it, you understand that transition can come in different shapes and sizes, and they can come together. It can get a bit complex as you move along. Now let's come and look at the more practical bits, right? Now that we know what transition is, and I kind of share how we can size them up, right? And we can also have a little sense of how they impact us, so we can be more prepared. If we're more serious in making transition work for us, we have to invest some time and energy to manage it. So first up, and not surprising, finding out as much information, knowledge about the transition is important. Is often very useful. Not so much about information about the change itself, right? Some of us will find out a lot about the job, but sometimes we neglect to ask about and find out about the transition into the job. Or sometimes we don't find enough transition into relocation, for example. So I'll give you an example. One of our students, so again, mid-career change individual, she's a high flyer in the corporate world. And then she kind of has this intention. She wants to move from the corporate world to become a professional helper, a counselor, and wants to take up the Masters of Guidance and Counseling program. So we talked to our marketing manager, and after that, I think she managed to talk to alumni who eventually refer her to us. We have a good chat, right? And then she try to find out as much as she can. And then I kind of linked her up to a current student that we have, who's of kind of similar profile, right? He's also doing very well in the corporate world, who also wants to have the intention to become a professional helper and counselor, right? And then he's in the midst, he's about to graduate, right? So he's kind of been there, done that, right? So she had a good chat with him, and she really enjoyed that, and particularly, she's really not asking about how well the course is and so on and so forth. I'm sure that was taken care of by the marketing bit of things, but she's really very curious and anxious about the transition. So she asked a lot of questions about how you move on from a corporate person, to go to become a professional counselor, what kind of you're moving from private sector and sometimes to the people sector. What does that feel like? What is it like? So she's really excited about that. And after that talk, she feels much more assured this is what she wants to do. Yeah. So if you are going to do relocation, and of course you're getting married and you have a child and start a family and so on and so forth, it's always good to talk to somebody which is similar to you and be there, done that, right? And the conversation should focus not just on the destination or the goal, right? It's not about how do you take care of a child and so on and so on. I mean, that's important. That's why we all go to prenatal classes, right? But what is important is to ask about the transition. So how do you transit your lifestyle, for example, right? Couple and then to have a child, maybe two in the family, and so on and so forth. Same thing with relocation. So talk about the transition, sometimes the nitty-gritty details, right? That might give you some knowledge and info and say, well, I didn't realize that it's like that, right? Because the process. So sometimes we ask and we focus too much on the destination. Yeah. Well, when you are making the transition, sometimes you consider, we say it's about change, right? One state to the other. And then, so I'm not going to say that you shouldn't change, but there's some part of it, is there some things that you can remain unchanged, right? That can give you more predictability or comfort and so on and so on and so on and so forth. It can be something big, right? Or it can be something small. It could be just your favorite cup of coffee from the favorite coffee chain. So you make sure in the new job, the building or somewhere near the building, there's the same coffee chain, right? An outlet where you can get your morning coffee. So can one or something remain unchanged, right? So that perhaps will help you along the way in preparing for transition, right? At least you know there's some parts that is not changed. Similarly, if talking about changing of a job, it might be important to talk about what are some things you can retain some control over, which may be important to you. For example, some people may be very particular about their timing and work time because they have to take care of young children and so on and so forth. So they negotiate for some control over their timing, right? Some wanted a bit more flexibility, right? Some wanted it to be more fixed so that it's more predictable. So some control over there. Some may want to have more control over the scope of work. Some wants to have a bit more freedom and control part of the work. So some of all this can be part of your negotiation with your new employer, right? If you liked. In marriage, sometimes in marriage preparation, some couple will talk about maybe more control of their own me time, right? How much me time they can have, whether they keep to their soccer practice with their brothers and what have you, or the me time, shopping and what have you. Some couple also talks about maybe some control of their own finances, right? So some control, retain some control over certain things that is important to you during the transition tends to be quite helpful. It gives you a sense of control, right? Another thing that's quite important is when you go through each transition, most of the time it's more intentional. Sometimes it's not, I would say unexpected and so on. But it's always good to ask ourselves, what is going to be better with the transition, right? You're going through so much, perhaps, you may have to fight tooth and nail to kind of move up the journey, for example, right? So you need to be reminded that what is going to be better, right? Is the view going to be better, the breeze going to be better up there, and so on and so forth. Or you're going to have more time with this work, or you have going to be perhaps more resources if you liked, right? And I work with some couples who are going through divorce, and sometimes it helps for some of them who then decide to say, you know what, as the relationship is not working out, they then know that the transition to divorce is then they can have more time and energy on the partner side to do the co-parenting work. Of course, this is a good case. This is a case where it works out pretty well. So again, so it's about figuring out for themselves what is going to be better. Now, the last 4 is really to prepare when things don't go the way that it happens that you want it to be. Remember the diagram we show? There's a chance that things that doesn't happen the way it should be. And then it's good to then, in preparation, to know who can help you and what kind of help do you need, be it logical, be it logistical, biological, physical, financial, emotional, relational, what have you, right? And have some preparation of who can help you, right? Maybe it's a relative, maybe it's somebody, and so on. So have some backup plans a little bit, right? So that will set you in a good sense of being prepared for transition. Now I'm going to move on to talk about, as we go through transition, how can we accumulate crystallized intelligence, and why is it important? Remember just now we talk about the journey, right? So if you're going to move up, you're going to move from maybe town to town or to one settlement to another, one state to the other. There's this journey of transition to move up. So it's really quite important to reflect upon the attitudes that have changed across. I think you and I, and we all, as we grow up, we realize our worldview changes, right? Our attitude changes. And sometimes we don't look enough to understand where and how it did or it changed, right? So if you think about it, if you can climb a mountain, right? If you have an easy path, an easy transition, right? Almost like an escalator right up to the top. You will enjoy the breeze, the good view, right up the top at the peak, and so on and so forth. But if you haven't had that nice and smooth transition, if you have tough route that you have to walk past, you have to deal with a lot of problems, and then you fight tooth and nail for it, and you get up to the peak, you still get the same breeze, you still get the same view, but your attitude will be a bit different. Your appreciation will be a bit different. And that's how it changes us, right? The journey, the transition, not just the destination. Destination, of course, changes us, right? At a new pivotal point, we see things differently and so on and so forth. But the transition, the pathway itself would have contributed what it has. So it's important for us to review how have our attitude change after each transition, right? And it takes some reflection to do. I also like to point out about skills. Sometimes we talk about learning new skills and so on and so on and so on and so forth. Perhaps it's good for us to think about also some old skills or skills we have learned but we have not used, for example, right? Like some I see now, a lot of people are bringing out their baking and culinary skills and then come out almost to develop their own business, right, at home, right? So some of this may be even people who play certain instruments, they're very good at it, like guitar and piano, and eventually take up some upgrading and then become piano teacher, for example. So sometimes we have skills and knowledge that we have, right? It's installed, and then but we somehow forget about it. So sometimes it's good also to think about that. So figure out what we are good at, what we can learn to, and also to be honest about what some difficulties that we have. I think that's important in terms of building self-awareness. But on this point, I think what is most important is really the reflection so that we see how we have grown in terms of our attitude. Now, which brings me to the point of growing from transition to transition, because remember we say because the process is continuous, right? We're moving from one to the other. So transition is happen almost continuously, right? So as if transit, it may be really good to look at who we were before, because as we transit, we move forward, we can look back and say who we were before and who are we now, who are we transiting onwards, right? As we reflect upon how each transition have changed us, you realize that you're actually accumulating a lot of knowledge, a lot of resources, whether physical resources, whether it is psychological resources, emotional, social, and so on and so forth. And one exercise sometimes we thought is quite fun to do, right? Quite interesting to do, is to write your own autobiography or memoir, all right? It's basically about our own story, right? You don't have to publish it, but not to worry. But if you want to, of course you can, right? And then it's especially useful. It's about knowing ourselves, right? And figuring out the life journey we have been up to this point and how you've contributed to who we are today. This may be particularly useful in today where a lot of people talk about imposter syndrome, right? a lot of self-doubting and so on and so forth. So have good awareness about ourselves, our strength, our resources, where we have been, our journey, and so on and so forth. It may help us a little bit to feel less of this imposter syndrome, right? And it's quite interesting as we reflect upon, you are literally writing your own life story. And sometimes we say, how nice if we have some stories we can pass on and tell our grandchildren. And I think sometimes we miss the point there. I think we should be our own fan of our own story, right? We should be ready to write it down. We should be our own fan and love to read our own story, our life story, because sometimes we miss part of it, right? And then perhaps we don't have enough of those perhaps good memories and so on. So put it down, write it down, and then put it up about who we are, and then what it built us, what is the crystallized knowledge or wisdom that you have. Now, once you have those stories, if you find that you are able to get your grandchildren to put down their iPad and the phone aside to listen to your story, then by all means, right? But if not, we should be most interested in our own life story. Yeah. Now, just kind of the last slide before we go into the question and answers. So I'll just do a bit of a roundup while you pick your brains and then put in some of the questions. So to sum up, transition are unavoidable, but they're not all bad, right? In fact, it's the pathway and the journeys that link us to the key events of our life, without which we can only watch the destination and not reach them, right? Because the transition is really the important bit. So today we took time to examine this phenomenon, and they come in different shapes and sizes. You can come all together, or you can move sequentially. So recognizing them so that you can ride the waves, right? Recognizing them and be more prepared, perhaps. More importantly, after each transition, especially successful ones, it's important to reflect upon one's growth, whether in skills, knowledge, and attitudes that will have a sense of growing up. And really, if we do that regular enough, it builds one's crystallized intelligence or wisdom, if you like. Right? So those will go down towards self-discovery, self-awareness, and self-mastery and you prove to be quite useful, I believe, in more aspects of our life. So self-awareness is useful where we can be, especially we know there's new transition coming along, but yet at the same time, everybody needs help at some point of our life, and knowing what we may need from who and where is important in two ways. One, we remain prepared. Two, you remain in control, right? You remain to be making the decisions, whether you seek a counselor's help or psychologist or a friend or a relative and so on. It's really a sign of strength and an exercise of autonomy and control. Yeah. So that's wrapped up quite a bit. I'm getting ready to look at some exciting questions and to address them. Let me, if I can stop sharing and get to the Q&A. Yeah. Here we are. Let's see. Let's try with this question. Do you have a solution if we can't get to the next stage because of a different cultural problem, right? Well, so it really depends on what we are referring to. It could be about work, it could be about family, but culture is often a big part of any transition, because in different culture, people's attitude towards problems can be very different. People's way of thinking of solutions can be very different. So if you do not have a solution at this point of time, and you know you're going to move on to the next stage and next phase, which I may not know in full context what it is, right? It's then perhaps important to seek help or talk to a neutral party. It could be somebody, as we mentioned just now, somebody who's been there, done that, right? So, or maybe a counselor of the same culture, if you like, right? Whether they help you a little bit to better kind of unpack what the problem is a little bit, yeah? Moving on, let's see. Okay, this is Kenzia, is it? Annabelle. Why do some people fail in life transition? What causes life transition to go the wrong way sometimes? Well, as much as we say that we all experience in life transition and so on, we're experts sometimes, I would say. But there are times that we all, we made it and sometimes we fall, right? So all of us also fail in some life transition here and there, right? Some point or the other. Especially I move around jobs quite a little bit, so sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So if you do it often enough, there could be a possibility that your life transition doesn't really go the way that you want it to be. What causes? It could be many reasons. It could be one of those reasons, and I think the top we are trying to address is that one of those reasons is not being prepared. Right? And if it's an unexpected event, then perhaps it's hard to prepare, but sometimes it's an expected event or scheduled event, for example, a marriage, then there's a lot that can be prepared for. There's marriage counseling. And you realize that a lot of times when we first launch out to a job, right, to the workplace, right, we often seek career counseling and so on, we prepare ourselves very well, right? But after we get into the industry and so on, as we change job, we then stop seeking consultation. We then stop seeking support, which, so some preparation often goes to help to ensure the transition work out very well. That's why I say a lot of energy and resources is poured into relocation, right? So the other thing I just want to say about life transition going the wrong way. Now, most of the time it doesn't fail, right? It just doesn't happen fully in a way that that you figured that you want. It can be a little bit disappointing, but most often than not, it kind of worked out and so on and so forth. Yeah, good. Oh, this is another very good question by somebody called FL, where you share the same initial as me. So, so thanks for the good sharing. How do you plan for unexpected or unwanted transition? Well, quick answer is you probably can't, because if it's unexpected, it's perhaps a bit harder for you to kind of prepare for, right? You don't know even where to start, right? If you liked, but there are really ways that you can be prepared for transition in life in general, as I talked about just now, is to really look at the accumulated wisdom and knowledge that you have, right? From past transition, that will put you in a good state, a good awareness about who you are, what you are, and what you're good at, right? You put the best foot forward. What comes may, right? They say, right? And then usually set you in a better position. Now, unwanted transition is something else. Yeah, I think unexpected is one. Unwanted can be a little bit more difficult to deal with, and often it comes in so, for example, unwanted job loss, right? Unwanted changes in family constitution, and so on and so forth. So those tends to be it tends to be a sense of loss. So it's not just about transiting. There's tends to be a sense of loss, which can be a little bit more difficult to deal with. So of course, seeking individual therapy and counseling and all this will be useful, because then the counselor can contextualize, what's kind of going on, and then you can then curate your own way to deal with it. Yeah. Okay. Let's look at some other questions. What is your advice? So somebody asked, I think, is it Henry? Asked about what about people who lose their job during the pandemic with uncertainty situation? What is your advice? And do we need consultation and so on and so forth? Well, again, a very broad question. The pandemic has an effect, right? It actually has effect on everybody, and we are all in transition together. Yeah. So the good thing is, because we're all going through it, so there tends to be already a lot of information and sometimes a lot of help during this uncertain time, right? Because the problem is noted by much of the society, and resources are put in put up maybe talks like this or some other help and so on. So that's one, right? But if you need to have more customized help, then of course your individual consultation will be really useful, right? Because when individual consultation, you can really bring in the various other factors we talked about just now about your perhaps even your personality, about the context of the situation, your past experience, and so on and so forth. Yeah. We can kind of move on. Let's see whether we have time for maybe one more question. I think this is quite interesting, isn't it? By Will Cole, right? What is the best way to help people who tends to procrastinate and cannot find the energy to initiate process to help him or her to transition to the next situation? Yeah, so this got to do with whether the transition is planned, right? So in this case, it sounded like somebody who don't have the initiative or motivation or energy to move on to the next state. So more often than not, the person must have the intention wanting to go to that destination, and we can talk about the transition. Yeah, so procrastination can really be another topic. I suppose I think HeadHunt Brownback can organize another session on procrastination, and I think my colleague did a talk in Brownback on motivation just a couple of days back, and I think they have a recorded version that you can take a look at that as well. Yeah, that would be useful. It's more towards motivation, if you liked. Let me just take a last look. Let me just attend this from Judia. Are there any academic research model that address transition? Yes, there are. There's a lot of research being done about transition. So there's models that look at how in transition things go down, and then at which point it goes up again, and so on and so forth. And a lot of times we focus on things that doesn't go very well, right? And how that transition, the trajectory, if you like. And sometimes we also refer that to even the grief model in therapy and counseling. So how does one deal with a negative event or a negative experience, right? And then what are some things that in therapy that we can help? For example, allowing somebody to be at a certain state to be really angry with the unexpected event, for example, right? So that might be useful at that point of time and not rush the person through. So it's often used in address in therapy, right? So if you're interested, we can connect up and talk a little bit more with that. So I'll probably close the Q&A. I really like a lot of very fine question over here. And I hope if I have a chance to be able to respond at a later date, perhaps that should be fine. If not, I will pass you to my colleague who tells you a little bit more about JCU, and perhaps your next transition is up and coming. To you, David.
Hi, thank you, Professor Frederick. So I hope all of you have enjoyed his presentation. So allow me to have a quick sharing of James Cook University, as well as some of the offering in relation to the talk today about transition, which will be featuring our psychology course and counseling course. I have also typed in the JCU email towards our microsite. In case you are rushing for time, you can always check out that shortened URL and get in touch with us. So allow me to have a quick sharing of about 5 minutes. Okay, great. Thank you. So James Cook University in Singapore itself, we are ranked among the top 2% of the university worldwide. We are the first one to actually achieve EduTrust Star in Singapore, and also the first one to renew. That sum up all the academic quality and the service that we provide to the student in the highest level. And For those that are unaware, we are the only private university that is recognized by Singapore government, aside from our 6 autonomous university. So this is how our campus look like. More picture will be going on regarding our facilities and service. So some of you also will probably like to know, are we accredited? What are our courses? So whether it's our courses in business program or in counseling, psychology, we all have the association recognition. So this is just some of them. So aside from Singapore campus, our main campus will be in Townsville and Cairns in Queensland of Australia. So more pictures about our facilities. So as a full university, you will see that probably we have quite a number of facilities compared to some other private institutions that operate in probably one of the retail mall. Okay, as a full university, we also offer clubs and societies. Whether you are a part-time student or full-time student, we always welcome students to mix around and join all the clubs and society. Okay, this is just a quick snapshot of our full-time academic in JCU. As you would notice, one very prominent aspect, all of them actually hold a PhD degree in their respective teaching capabilities. Okay, just a very quick overview. This is in relation to our psychology, education, and health course. Just a quick overview. I will just highlight 2 courses. If you guys are interested, we can get connected and I will send an email to hopefully share more information with you. So this is our Master of Psychological Science, is majoring in business psychology. It's actually designed very similarly to what we know as organizational psychology, to solve current issue on motivating staff in the workplace as a leader, including solving organizational transformation. So this course is very relevant to the current COVID situation that many people are struggling. The next course will be talking about our Master of Guidance and Counseling. As what Professor Frederick has mentioned, there are a lot of life transactions. There are people that require some sorts of counseling, whether it's family issue, whether it's career-related issue. So this course allows students to get professional recognition as a counselor by Singapore Association of Counselors, as well as the Australian version of it. So this is just a quick snapshot for those that already have a psychology degree relevant. They can have different pathway. And for those that are interested in professional masters such as clinical psychology, there are specific pathway that you need to take in order to qualify for that. So a quick snapshot of our faculty again in the psychology and clinical psychology department. Some of their interests in the area of psychologies, some of their track record about their published journal and where they are trained. And I hope you have enjoyed the seminar today. And do note there will be one more brown bag event by our speaker, Dr. Zara, on 21st of October. So again, my name is David. I'm from Continuing Education within James Cook University to give information about all part-time program degrees and as well as higher research degree. So again, this is my contact. I'll probably just pause here for 10 seconds in case you would like to take a snapshot of the QR code to connect with us. Otherwise, we'll be happy to connect with you all via email if you're interested to find out more information about our course or our events. That's all from me. Thank you so much. I will end my presentation now. And let me stop share and over back to you, Tammy.
Thank you. Thank you, David and Frederick, for being with us today. We hope you've enjoyed today's session and we'll now invite you to participate in our feedback poll. Please give us your honest feedback so that we can further improve on our brown bag series. The feedback poll should be popping up on your screen anytime, so please take a few moments to share with us your observations.